have a special guest, Mr. Chuck Vidian, a historical archaeologist with over 40 years of experience working in the Mid-Atlantic region. He has a master's degree from Salisbury University, concentrating in colonial and revolutionary America. He was responsible for the curation of the state of Delaware's extensive over 4 million artifact and archaeological collection throughout his tenure with the state of Delaware. And he is here today to talk about John Dickinson's manuals. So with that, let's all welcome Mr. Chuck Vidian.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. Welcome to the Delaware Public Archives. Sometimes I like to think of it as the temple of knowledge. There's all kinds of things here. So I highly recommend that if you have time, spend some time here with a capable staff. They can guide you through any historical questions and other issues that they may have in mind. So again, welcome and thank you for coming. Today I'd like to talk to you about a topic you may not be that familiar with. And that's John Dickinson's military role. Some of you may be sitting there thinking, the guy was a Quaker. What is he doing with this? And we'll explore that. We'll explore that option or topic, looking through the prism of something that he produced while he was president of the Delaware State, and that is a military manual that he had to develop to help prepare the state of Delaware for the defense. And we'll get into the various aspects of what he did to produce the copy of the manual that you see here. You'll see that he produced about 500 copies of it. Only 5 are known to survive today. 2 are here. And you have a chance to see them. So let's get started. We'll do this in 2 parts. The first part will kind of go through what President Dickinson was dealing with when he became president in late 1781. And we'll also look at the military system, the manual that he produced. And then what I'd like to do at the end is show you a little segment of the manual exercise that he required of his men. We'll demonstrate with the musket and give you an idea of what he considered to be concise, easy, and efficient. All right, so let's get started. First, let's sort of take the 30,000-foot view and kind of talk about military manuals in general. And they've been a part of the literature of Western civilization for a long time. De Re Militarii Vegetatis is probably one of the most complete and earliest military manuals that we have. It dates to the late Roman Empire, and it looks at all different kinds of aspects of training and discipline and maneuvering and things like that. And you'll see a quote from him: "Troops who march in an irregular, disorderly manner are always in great danger of being defeated." And that's one of the great debates that military manuals had. Do men walk in step? We kind of think it's fairly obvious, but sometimes it wasn't. So the military manuals addressed even down to specific questions like that. The manual continued into the Middle Ages. It was very widely used. And then as Europe went through what historians refer to as the military revolution, military manuals flourished. Every topic you can possibly think of, from drill to how to lay a camp out, how to build a star-shaped fortification, to cavalry, to the specifics of various firearms, their various merits and all that. They just literally take off and become incredibly numerous. That lasts until the 18th century, and you'll see manuals that continue. And then during colonization, that knowledge, those skills and those manuals arrive with the various leaders of the American colonies as they set up colonial governments, of which the militia system would be a part of. Moving into the 18th century, several that held sway on military thinkers would be Wyndham's Norfolk Exercise, Bland's Military Treatise, which is hugely popular, one of Washington's favorites, the German exercise, and then the King's 64 exercise that you see in the middle. These were some of the most popular ones. They weren't the only ones, but they were some of the most popular. The King's exercise, or the 64, as sometimes it was known, was actually, copies of it were printed by James Adams in Wilmington. It was definitely used by the Delaware militia. It was definitely used by the Delaware Regiment in its early years prior to Valley Forge. So very influential treatises on how to do things. When the war started and Washington became commander-in-chief of the Continental Army at Boston in 1775, one of the very first things he was concerned about was what he referred to as the diversity of modes of training used in the regiments. So all of these manuals are in circulation, which was neat, but it was a problem, because you had guys over here doing one thing, you had guys over here doing something else, guys in the middle were coming up with something else altogether different. And it really bothered him, because in his mind, the only way that you're going to create an effective army is to have a standardized set of discipline, a standardized set of tactics, standard set of regulations. He really fought with that through the early couple of years of the war. Well, the solution to this problem arrived in the head of this man, Baron von Steuben. Now, I'll let you read his full name. It'll take a while to read it. He had been a veteran in the German service. He had served under Frederick II, which was Frederick the Great. And he did this very same kind of thing. He was a great administrator. He knew how to train men. He worked with very elite formations of German troops prior to coming to America. Franklin was very instrumental in getting him here, and he was introduced to Washington early on, and the two men became very close friends. The more important aspect of von Steuben's presence was his ability to do these changes that Washington was very actively trying to create. He knew this was the man to create this set of disciplines. And he did that at Valley Forge. He created what was referred to as the model company. These were men that sometimes came out of the commander-in-chief's guard, but others were selected for their intellectual ability and physical abilities, and they were trained under the Baron's direct guidance, as you see here. And from what some of the officers were saying, that guidance could get really colorful in its language. And officers would have to translate from his German into French and then into English. And so it was a very, very complicated process. But once these men were proficient, they then trained the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and the corporals. They then went to their regiments and helped the officers, in some cases, and the enlisted men learn the new exercise, or the Prussian exercise that sometimes some of the soldiers later on in their veterans depositions would refer to it. This actually began in March of 1778 and would continue on to the rest of the war. Continental soldiers were drilled on average 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, sometimes more depending on what they may have needed. Once that became the established drill, copies were made and then went to the regiments. But in 1779, it was actually formally published by the printing firm of Steiner and Sisk in Philadelphia. Popularly known as the Blue Book, it acquired that nickname because of the blue binding that the original printers used, and copies would be distributed throughout the Army and would be used by the commissioned officers as well as the non-commissioned officers. Not that they were given copies necessarily, but copies were available. Sorry about that. Initially, von Steuben wanted the drill to be confined to the use of the Continental Army. He looked at it as kind of a state secret, and he was not really crazy about it being handed out to the militia in the States. But Washington overruled it, and it became a manual that was used, I'm skipping the slide here. Oh, excuse me. I'm getting ahead of myself. So it became a manual used by the militia, but the significance of the regulations, as they also were known, by the Army, was what it created. It created the first professional fighting force that was developed by the United States. It was the very first one. This was a professional army. They were highly trained, and through the course of the war, the Continental Army gained a parity very close to the British Army, if not equal to it. And historical research related to the Guilford Courthouse, particularly the performance of the Maryland and Delaware troops, showed them on an identical parity with elements of the British Army. And we're talking Brigade of Guards. These are the guys you see on parade at the Horse Guards Parade in London on the Queen's birthday. Today's their descendants. There's the 23rd Foot Royal Welsh Fusiliers. The 33rd Foot were heavily professional forces. In fact, the 33rd Foot got the nickname of the pattern because it became the mode or the standard by which all the other regiments in the British Army were trained. So these were the men that the Continental Army rose to that level and were on an equal level. So and this is how we gained independence, folks. We tend to think in our mythology oh, it's the embattled shopkeepers and stalwart farmers and all this kind of stuff. True, but only up to a point. It took this to secure independence. That kind of discipline, that regularity, that be able to take their place in the demands of linear warfare of the 18th century. And we also tend to look at it somewhat mythologized pattern. It was like, well, why do they stand in front of each other and blaze away at each other in full sight? That's not because they were dumb. That was because they were operating within the technological limits of the firearms that they had available. And that was the best application, the best way tactically to do that. And it took an iron discipline to be able to stand there and do this with chaos reigning all around you, at every minute. So as I started to say, von Steuben did not want this to go very far, but Washington overruled him and he began to use the drill for militia. And in a letter to Congress, Steuben admits that it's a good discipline for regulars as well as the militia of the various states that begin to use it. So here's a case of the Continental Army's drill and training working down into other levels of the American military, specifically the militias of the various states. So with that in mind, when Dickinson becomes president in November of 1781, he inherits a state that was in really very difficult straits, particularly financially and fiscally. The repeated demands on Delawareans throughout the course of the war had drained a lot of the state's resources. It had drained manpower, it had drained the state's finances in really some significant ways. But that was just one of a host of various things that he had to deal with. But in coming in, he quickly realized that the military defense of the state was going to be primary. Even though Delaware had not been really savaged by military campaigns like some of the other states in the South, it still faced very critical military issues. And in his nature, he very quickly sized up that this was something that he had to deal with primarily. So you may be asking, like, well, if this man was a Quaker, where did he get this military experience? But as you can see, by the time he became president, he had a lot of it. He started out as a colonel of the Philadelphia Associators out of the city of New York, and actually took his men into the field in northern New Jersey right after independence. He's one of two members of Congress who, once the Declaration was signed, actually was in uniform and took to the field. He comes back, he then later serves as a private soldier and a scout during the Philadelphia campaign. And that act in and of itself is really intriguing because here you have a man who technically is one of the economic elites in Delaware and in Pennsylvania, but he submerges that and becomes a private soldier. That just wasn't just sort of a simple thing he decided to do. That was sort of a really interesting inversion of 18th century hierarchy and what the obligations of various economic statuses. That act that he did sort of turns that upside down, in some respects, and he serves in that capacity. But after that, he goes on, he has active correspondence with military officers at all levels, from Washington all the way down to line officers, captains, and majors. And then one of the other things that he did was help create a state naval force. Delaware's not usually credited with creating anything like that. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia had huge naval forces, and they created at the beginning of the war. Delaware did a very similar thing. It wasn't nearly as big or nearly as involved, but he did do it. Dickinson sat down and made arrangements to help create state naval vessels, actually got them fitted out and patrolled the Delaware River and Bay against Crown naval forces that were very active. In one case, he went out on his own personal credit to buy a vessel, and gradually the state paid him back. But a lot of his military activities came out of his own pocket. So one of the things that he faced was a very significant and very strong Loyalist presence within the state. The Loyalist presence never went away. And if you look at records that are here in the archives of writers and colonial leaders or state leaders that are talking about this, it is always here. It's like this menace that's sort of out on the landscape And throughout the course of the war, it never went away until really Dickinson's administration. And it manifested itself in different ways. Sometimes it opened insurrection in 1776, right after the Declaration was signed. 78 with Cheney Cloud's rebellion here in Kent County, and then the Black Camp in 1780. There were some minor ones that came up, various efforts, but those are the principal phases of insurrection. Disruption of revolutionary government. Leaders like Silas Snow were abducted. There was an effort at abducting Thomas Collins at Smyrna, an effort at abducting John Dickinson in 1781. And then there were also outside influences that were operating as well. These were being funded and supported by the Board of Loyalists in New York. And these involved things such as interaction with British naval vessels that were coming into the river, active taking supplies, things like grain, wheat, cattle, pigs, things like that, where Delawareans were supplying the British ships themselves. So this sort of Delaware loyalism sort of manifested itself in a lot of different ways. Part of this thread is very maritime. The Delaware Bay was a major economic artery that had been that way since all through the colonial period and remained so. And the thing is, the British knew that too. And they knew that if they could shut the Delaware down, just like they were doing in the Chesapeake, that would create economic discord, which then would translate into political, into political action. So very clearly, a form of economic warfare. The Delaware itself can be very, very hard to defend against that, but it can also be very difficult to operate. Pretty much the same factors that made it difficult to defend also made it difficult for the British to operate it. But throughout, the various meandering river systems, the very large marsh system has posed very interesting environmental aspects for understanding the revolution and affecting the outcome and affecting what people did. And this, here's an example, sort of an outline of what the Crown forces look like. There's Royal Navy vessels, Loyalist privateers, and refugee whaleboats. This is a period of active Royal Navy operations, because now we're talking after Yorktown. The Royal Navy is now no longer confined to supporting the British Army on land. In the early part of 1782, Parliament has suspended military operations. Didn't include naval operations, just operations on land. So now the Royal Navy is free to roam at large, and one of the places they came to was Delaware Bay. And they arrived at a time when Congress had relieved the prohibition on the exportation of grain out of the Delaware Valley. So they're picking off grain ships, right and left. On top of the formal Royal Navy vessels are Loyalist privateers. We tend to make a big deal out of the American privateers during the war, but the Loyalists were doing it too, and the British were actively funding these vessels as well. And then the refugee whaleboats is another smaller subset of the same thing. But all of this is planned, and all of it is organized. Both these whaleboat crews as well as the Loyalist privateering, and they are very tactically adept. The previous writing and scholarship on Delaware in this period tends to dismiss these raids as a nuisance, as something minor. The war had moved on; it was in the Carolinas or in the Caribbean or something like that. And I think that's really a misread of kind of what's happening. What makes it look minor is the fact that this was a very form of irregular warfare. This was not sort of massed armies, duking it out on land. This was irregular forms of warfare that takes the form of whaleboat raids that come up rivers to capture cattle or things like that. That is a part of tactical considerations as well. And what we're seeing is that these men who were doing this were very capable. And what's interesting is that some of the whaleboat crews had Delawareans in them. One even went as far as naming his whaleboat Lewistown's Revenge. So this will give you an idea of what one of these the whaleboats look like. This is a drawing that's in the National Maritime Museum in London, and here's a whaleboat crew actually coming ashore. Research by Andrew Leiter has uncovered the role of Delawareans in these boat crews. The other aspect of this is, if that wasn't enough, Dickinson The president is also dealing with anticipation of a military campaign in the mid-Atlantic. And again, some of you may be going, well, Yorktown just took place. Cornwallis surrendered. The British Army was, went to, prisons, throughout the country. So why is there another campaign? But in looking at all the correspondence between Washington, Caesar Rodney, Dickinson himself, they did not think that that was it. Washington is repeatedly warning Americans, don't get lax, don't get comfortable. Yes, we had a great victory. Yes, all these other good things happened, but I don't think it's over. They did not trust the peace commissioners, and they suspected that this would resume. And if you think about it, there's still 3 British armies in North America. There's one in Canada, there's one in New York, there's one in Charleston. So they easily could have started this all up again. Yeah, you just captured one of us, and that was it. We're starting it over. And the feeling was that it was going to be in the mid-Atlantic. All throughout the war, the British had always kept their eye on the mid-Atlantic colonies. Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, part of Pennsylvania. They understood the value of those estuaries that were there. So in the course of the war, even though it took them to the Carolinas, it took them into the New England areas, they always had their eye on the mid-Atlantic. And there was a sense that this was, Yorktown was not the end of it. And if you look at the correspondence throughout the last 2 years after Yorktown, say from October of 1781 to September of 83, Americans are feeling less than confident that this was over, that this could easily begin. And there's correspondence, there's circulars from Washington to the governors, there's a correspondence from Washington to Dickinson, basically saying, I don't think this is over, I think you guys are going to be in front of it. So I want you to be ready. I want you to be ready to have to handle that. So the best tool that he had was the Delaware militia. This was the militia system had been instituted at the beginning of the 18th century and had evolved a little bit, but essentially it was a county-based system that consisted of enrolled and volunteer companies, horse troops, 3 regiments in each county, and then the manpower drawn from geographic districts within each of the counties. I've tried to figure this out, but they use parts of the cultural landscape that are hard to determine. Or they'll say it starts at the big oak at the mouth of the creek and goes to so-and-so's mill, and then down to Hattie Smith's house, and it's just like, trying to figure out where they're talking about driving crazy. But these became the basic mechanism for how the manpower for the militia was drawn, so they could pull men out at certain intervals and in certain ways. Again, it's a county-based system, generally consists of all white, able-bodied males. But I want to put a big question mark at that. We know from other evidence that wasn't that simple. The African Americans were participating in this as well. All through the course of the war, they had done various service, both in military units and in civilian capacities. So even though that's what the regulations or the laws stated, the practice can sometimes be very different. So I think we need to sort of be a little bit cautious on saying, well, there's only white guys doing this. Chances are that that's not the case, and there's a good chance that there were black guys in his Loyalist whaleboat cruises as well. With your basic companies, you'll see that at the bottom. There's 3 commissioned officers, 8 non-commissioned officers, a drummer and a fifer, and no less than 65 private men. So that was the tool that the president had immediately at his disposal to confront these very serious military questions. Here's some of the brigadiers general, Patterson, Collins, and Dagworthy, regimental commanders such as Gunning Bedford and Nathaniel Mitchell. They had seen service in the Continental Army. The David Hall, well, I'm not quite sure who he is. He could be the colonel of the Delaware Regiment. He might be his father. So we're not really sure. Both of them had that title, and sometimes the correspondence doesn't indicate. And then Thomas Duff is a militia officer who also had extensive service. He had fought at Cooch's Bridge earlier in the war. So the core officer staff of the Delaware system had a great deal of experience. So Dickinson was fortunate to have these men who were seasoned. Both Bedford and Mitchell were combat veterans, as well as David Hall. Is the same man. So there's a body of experience that he can draw off of, and that experience probably also included some of his non-commissioned officers too, who may have had prior service in the French and Indian War, and maybe earlier in the earlier campaigns like the Philadelphia campaign. So one of the things that he wanted to do is that he was well aware of the need for a standardized drill. And in sometime prior to April 15th, he sat down with he had to have had a copy of the full regulations printed by Steiner and Sist. And what he does is he begins to extract out of it what he feels is this system that's easy, simple, and concise and efficient. He basically sits and he'll take one section out verbatim, and then he'll take another chapter out verbatim, and then he'll add parts of the other to create his own. So he's really carefully reading the full regulations to be able to do this. There's a very similar manual produced by the state of Pennsylvania. At face value, they look to be the same, but they're not. Dickinson included some things that the Pennsylvanians did not do. So this isn't a simple matter of 18th century cut and paste. He actually said, read this very close. To give you an idea of how close it is, he even corrected a typo that's in the original. That when he extracted it, he extracted his part out of it, he corrected the typo for his manual. He had 500 copies printed, 400 copies were handed out to the officers and non-coms. And all that was by probably about June of 1782. So he'd done this, I think he'd probably been working on this for a while. I don't think you sit down and just sort of do that overnight. Not with the degree of thoroughness that he obviously approached this. The printer that printed it was Charles Sist, the same Sist of Steiner and Sist, who had produced the original regulations for the Army in 1779. So in it, what he included is a preface. It was a little missive that he wrote to the officers and privates of the Delaware militia. Basic company and battalion structure, a manual exercise, how the musket gets handled, loaded and fired and things like that. Basic company and battalion maneuvers and camp security. Yes, sir?
What year was the first battle here in Delaware? So this was written in 1782. I'm trying to figure the timeline. 1776 was independence. So what year do we have the first battles here in Delaware along the coast and on the land? I'm just curious.
The coastal battles would be 76. The first real sort of what would amount to a pitched fight was 77, Goose Bridge.
Okay.
So as you can see in the quote here, these are the things that he wanted his men to know. He wanted to improve their military knowledge, and he wanted them to become acquainted with Baron Steuben's very valuable treatise on the subject. So this is his missive to the officers and private men. He advances his confidence in them. He also outlines his expectations, and he doesn't expect to be disappointed in what he expects. But there's a lot in this, so I want to kind of skip this one for a minute and come back to it at the end. The first chapters is the formation of a company and regiment. Basically, he listed this straight out of the 1779 regulations. Each company is 2 platoons, and then each regiment is formed of 8 companies of 2 battalions, depending on the number of men they had available. And what I find really interesting with him is he kept the light infantry chapter in this as well, a paragraph in there as well. That's straight out of the manual. Light infantry was a very elite type of soldier. They were part of Continental Army regiments that, by this time they'd become official in 1778. And he kept that in there. You go, what? He doesn't really talk about anything with it. He doesn't describe anything. He doesn't say anything. But the fact that he included it seems to me to indicate that he had some expectations here, that here's going to be the regular militia that I'm going to depend on, but then I want to create a special group of guys to be able to do even more. Otherwise, I don't know why he would have bothered to include it. He had read the original regulations so completely and so thoroughly that you could easily say, well, I'm not going to worry about that, so I'm not going to do it. But he included it. And I find that to be a really curious part of his company and regimental section. And then it ends with the position of the soldier under arms. This is an illustration of it. This is the first time that the various positions in the manual are illustrated. And that's one thing that I want to mention to you guys, is that as he handled these manuals out, he expected the officers and men to train these men, but it was not illustrated. It was all verbal, all descriptive. So that presents a huge problem in maintaining consistency. But really the first time that the manual was illustrated was 1798, and then as a manual, not until 1802. But here's the basic position. The manual arms begins and ends with it. That is the critical position. The man with the musket at the shoulder, his left eye over his waistcoat button. In other words, his head is turned to the right. That is so he can keep an eye on a flugelman, who is a man who is standing out in front of the ranks, who performs the manual, who is one of the better soldiers, who will perform the manual exercise. So the other guys are constantly watching him and imitating. Then the manual exercise itself, the loading and firing of the musket. This is geared to the basic motions that it takes to move the gun around your body in an efficient, prescribed way. There's 54 basic measurements or movements, 15 in just to load and fire the gun, itself. So this took a great deal of time. As I mentioned earlier, the Continental soldiers are trained anywhere from 4 to 6 hours a day, depending on the time period. So how Dickinson and these men were able to get proficient with this is very hard to understand. I learned how to do this manual back during the bicentennial, and it just takes days to get this straight in your head. And again, you got to remember that you're expected to remember this while chaos is reigning all around you, in a battle. Then once the men have learned how to handle and successfully maneuver this musket around their body, then the training moves into the company exercises. So it's getting into a larger group of number. The men by the individual companies would be exercised together. And then moving on from company, you get into battalion, and here are the various things that he included: with the prescription of the firings, how to march, wheelings for each one of these, and then the order of firing itself. Battalion fire means that this is a process by which the line will level its muskets and fire. And there is a system to that. These guys just aren't blazing away on their own. There was a very regularized pattern where one company would fire, this company's reloading, this company would fire, so forth down the line. And then by the time it was at the end, these guys would be reloading, these guys are firing, these guys are reloading. So that the line is never, the muskets in the line are never empty all at one time. That is a very bad thing to have happen. Particularly when you have an adversary who's across from you who's coming at you. The last thing you want to have is a bunch of guys with unloaded muskets. So these are drawings that kind of outline how a line wheels up, how a group of men will wheel from a battle line into the marching formations and back again. This takes, again, a lot of coordination and a lot of attention. We tend to think of military drill as you're just basically creating automatons, cogs in a machine. And that's not really right, because these guys have to think about what they're doing. They have to have their training in mind, and they have to be paying attention to what their officers are saying, what the men around them are doing, and how they're actually and how they're performing and being attentive to what they're being instructed to do. Yes.
I'm wondering, and I guess you answered part of it by what you just said, the training of all of the officers named at the beginning must somehow be going on at the same time as all of the men that they're supervising, right, because they're coming in, most of them, with no military training. All of these officers are picked for important reasons that I assume have to do with personality and leadership as opposed to actual military experience.
Right. The guys that I showed you were just a selection. What I was trying to show on this is that there was a significant part of Delaware's officers who had combat experience. Like Nathaniel Mitchell was prominent in the Battle of Monmouth. He led the advance corps. So these men had some levels of training, which are right. Dickinson doesn't really talk about the officers too much, so I think there's sort of an implied expectation that they're going to be doing it. His focus is on the guys in the line, make sure it's non-coms and it's private, kind of know what they're doing.
At least one of the regimental commanders had a great deal of French and Indian experience. That would be John Dagworthy.
Yeah, Dagworthy, Hazlitt as well, although he had been killed at Princeton in 1777. So when you look at Delaware formations, there is a fair amount of military talent, that does exist. And fortunately, the president could draw upon that. So this becomes very involved. This combination of marching and wheeling from lines and combining that with handling the musket and being able to fire in a controlled fashion were all very complicated. And apparently they started doing this from about June until October of 1782. Quite how they did it, I'm not quite sure. There's not any real description. Dickinson is repeatedly asking them the status. He's repeatedly asking them about equipment. The firearms there was a very indifferent. There were some firearms that were owned by the state, but it wasn't enough. And one of the problems that they were running into was an indifferent ownership of guns. It wasn't pervasive. So a lot of these companies were being formed, and some of them didn't have it. You'll see like a company out of 60-some guys, 50 have muskets, and of the muskets, only 17 have bayonets. Things like that. So there was a logistical issue that Dickinson was running into, and he and his officers were constantly trying to find lead to make ammunition, powder to make cartridges, things like that. So that's another thing that's kind of working, at the same time that he's trying to get this organization and discipline started. He's trying to provide from the basic equipment. And then on the service of guards, this is his last chapter. There's discussions of camp security. As you can see here, the vigilance of an officer defends not only the safety of his guard, but that of the whole army. So there was a text on how guards get mounted, how they get relieved, the proper protocols for changing of guards. There's a protocol for parade, and then there's also the recognition of officers. And that last chapter is probably particularly important because in a militia system, you might have guys who are very familiar with each other in civilian life. One is a captain, the other is a private. And so by him outlining that system of recognition of rank, I think kind of was his way of speaking like, yes, you may know this guy, you may have bought land from him last week, but he's your captain now. And that's a whole different thing. You have to listen to what he tells you. So he was bolstering his officers' authority, by including those chapters. The various reviews and battalions that he wanted, battalion reviews were done throughout the course of October from the various letters and correspondence. We kind of know we know the names of the places. We're not quite sure exactly where some of them were. Dickinson was very busy throughout this month by seeing these reviews. They actually did take place. He allowed his men to pick the place and the time, and then he would come there to watch them perform the manual exercise and these various maneuvers that he had outlined. And then writing back to the Delaware legislature at the end of all of this, he seemed to be very pleased with what he saw. All of the restrictions of time, restrictions of material that these men faced, he seemed to be pretty satisfied that what had taken place was what he was looking for. So, but the question is, well, did it work? So they went through all of this. Is there any evidence that this bore any fruit? And there is. Shortly after the battalion reviews, there were several raids that were conducted, and the militia responded in record time that they had not done before. And the writer of the letter, which was one of the company captains to the president, was saying the Loyalists, or the rogues as he referred to it, now no longer come ashore or go to their rendezvous as they have done before. So what Dickinson had been trying to do, the indicator had been successful. The militia could respond and actively and accurately and on time as a particular counter. The raids didn't stop. Some of the last of the raids were like in March of 83, but they did begin to taper off. And I think it's really in Dickinson's administration that the Loyalist threat actually did begin to kind of recede a little, a little bit. Still out there, it's still a threat, but it did start to get tamped down in ways that it had not in the previous years of the revolution. So his accomplishments. He successfully faced some really complicated and trying circumstances. He improved the militia's capabilities. Part of the reason why he wrote the manual was he knew that if that campaign in the Mid-Atlantic starts, his men are going to have to work with the Continental Army. So they better know some of that drill, because the Continental Army is not going to put up with a bunch of shenanigans with guys who don't know what they're doing. And so that was part also in the back of his mind, that I have to be able to produce some degree of parity, some degree of working knowledge that my men need to have, that they could then function with the professional regulars of the Continental Army. And in all, I think he provided a very successful defense of the Delaware State. Now, the last two things I wanted to talk about, that kind of moves away from, these move away from the pragmatic considerations of state defense. And they get into some aspects of Dickinson's ideology and some of the more sort of political and ideological considerations that he wanted to convey in this. And this is sort of what I started talking about at the beginning, of where material culturalists look at objects in a very layered sense. So in other words, when does a teacup stop being just a teacup? What ideology does it project? Here's an axe that was used to build the Constitution. What's the backstory behind this axe? So it's kind of like, a euphemism of sort of peeling away the layers of an onion. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. Here's the pragmatic military side, but now the ideological side that Dickinson wants to convey. And he has a doctrine of defensive war. And some of his ideas actually sort of presage what's getting ready to happen in the constitutional era. The first is this idea of a well-regulated militia. We use that, we kind of throw that term around today, but it was always within two things. There's an obligation of free men of a republic to provide for the defense, and that defense is always a form of federalism between the states and the federal government. The idea of a militia existing outside of that was totally foreign to these men. The idea is that a militia would exist for those purposes and would always be subject to civil authority. And that's some of the ideas that I think Dickinson helped originate as they moved into the post-war constitutional convention. He's on the militia committee. And some of these things that he's writing about in letters popped up in the discussions. And I think we can kind of see them in other ways. So, and this takes place in an emerging form of nationalism. He's very much into this, where he's saying, you are now the members of a free republic. And it's a much larger vision. It's the militia to him is no longer this parochial little sort of formation within a colonial government. You are now participating on something that's in a national scale. And there are national expectations and national ramifications. And I think, in terms of material culture, very quickly, you kind of see this in the Continental Army button that you see here with USA. Even earlier there had been state designations, but as the war progressed, they begin to sort of decline, and archaeologically speaking, you get buttons with USA. So it's this national vision, that sort of begins to emerge. Dickinson is conveying that to his militia. You can see what he did become codified in the Constitution of the United States and in Delaware state law, where training regimens, training expectation is this federalism. But also here, the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. And here's almost the same language. Shall be the rules of discipline to be observed by the militia of the state in Delaware law. So this idea of using the drill of the regular army continued on and is manifested in our Constitution and is manifested in Delaware state law. So again, it's this idea of a federalism, between the states and the federal government. That will last until about 1820. Congress decides that a new manual needs to be put in place, and by authorization of the Congress, the von Steuben exercise is no longer used. The letters to Delaware's governor from Congress saying don't use the von Steuben anymore exist here in the state archives. And that takes place in 1820. So what Dickinson's challenges us to do a couple different things. You know, we tend to kind of think of the militia in this sort of caricatured way. In the early part of the 19th century, it was made fun of. You know, you get these guys are, kind of like stumblebums. You got the guy's hat on his bayonet, the guy's named Copeland, this kind of thing. It challenges something different. That maybe this did exist at times, but there was a distinct function that the militia had, and that was for participating in defense of the local states, local government. Continental Army could not be everywhere all at once, so there had to be a reliance. And new historical research is showing that the militia is adaptive. It responds to pressures. It responds militarily in some cases. It can be really bad at times, but it can be really good, in a lot of others, as guards against foraging operations, by the British, or engaging in irregular forms of combat along with the Continental Army. So what Dickinson is expecting of his men and what he's challenging them to do is challenges to think anew, on this. It also challenges the kind of thing saying what the Second Amendment means as well. A lot of his ideas are codified into this statement. There's a well-regulated militia as the overall arching concept of the Second Amendment. So I think his writing, his little manual, if you will, challenges today that maybe we need to think in new ways about what the Second Amendment may actually mean. And then his idea of defensive war. He kind of come back to his missive, that he wrote in the beginning of the manual, is that this outlines his expectations. So I expect you guys to be trained militarily. I expect you to have that working knowledge. It's an obligation of a free man. But what I don't want is American military prowess to be used for anything other than as a guard against injustice, as you see here. It says, I hope the martial spirit of Americans will never be inflamed by the wild and wicked suggestions of ambition or avarice. But I wish that noble temper of freedom always to prevail among them, that meaning no harm to others, vigilantly guards against injustice. Wow, that's a really a remarkable statement. And that really shows that a use of force is applicable in certain instances, but only in certain instances, and for the protection of the weak and to guard against injustice. That's really a very ennobling idea of what military experience should be and what military practice should lead to. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is to kind of, we'll end up with a little demonstration of what that manual exercise looked like and what Dickinson required. And I think I have found Dickinson's use of the term easy to be somewhat curious. Because it isn't, I think what he meant was it was simplified. Not necessarily, oh yeah, you guys can just go knock yourself out on Saturday afternoon, and there you go. So we've got the services of Sergeant Niemeyer over here, and she will actually issue the voice commands to do this. Not one of the necklaces. Dana, why don't you stand over here if you would, that way if I love to point it, not pointing it at you. What the men are using are actually prepared cartridges. Like you might. Oops. This is a type of prepared cartridge that would have been contained in the cartridge box. We're not talking powder horn, shot bags, all that, kind of loose ammunition. So the commands that she'll read out is the movement of the gun, the extraction of the cartridges, and the use of it. The muskets that you see here are one of several sort of patterns that militiamen would have had. They would have been in colonial armories that would have been stored in the basement of the State House, the second State House, in that house. So this is just one style. And one of the things that they ask of the men to help facilitate training are wooden dowels that you'll see here that will simulate the actual pulling out of a cartridge out of the cartridge box. And in the flint will be replaced by a wooden flint called a snapper or knocker, sometimes as they refer to it. Flints are hard to get a hold of, so you don't want to be wearing them out. And then you have to go into action and it don't spark right. I can show you what one looks like with actually a spark kind of beforehand. The stone is actually harder than the steel, so it scrapes the steel off, it ignites, lands into the powder charge, so you'll see the gear burns into the breech, explodes, and sends the ball on its
Chuck, have you ever actually fired those?
I have.
Does it have much of a kick?
If you overcharge it, yeah.
If you overcharge it.
No, not generally, because a black powder burns a little slower than moderate.
What is the timing between the flint and the actual charge?
It sounds really slow, but it's pretty quick. Fraction of a second. So what I'll do is I'll face this way, and Dana will put me through the exercise. So here's the position of the soldier under arms, the left eye over the waistcoat button, so there will be a flugelman standing over this way. All right, go ahead.
Poise. Fire lock. Cock. Fire lock. Take aim. Fire. Half cock. Fire lock. Handle. Cartridge. Prime. Shut pan.
It looks like you need more training.
Here's the wooden dowel.
Handle. Cartridge. Prime. Shut pan. Charge with cartridge. Draw. Rammer. Ram down. Cartridge. Return. Rammer. Take aim. Fire. Shoulder. Sorry. Shoulder. Shoulder. Fire lock. Order. Fire lock. Ground. Fire lock. Oh. Shoulder. Fire lock. Secure. Fire lock. Shoulder. Fire lock. Fix. Bayonet. Shoulder. Don't do that. Shoulder. Fire lock. Present. Arms. Shoulder. Fire lock. Charge. Bayonet. Shoulder. Fire lock. Oh, order.
There we go. There are other aspects of the drill, but that's sort of the very basics. I want to kind of give you guys a chance to see what was involved, what was involved in it, and the amount of time that it took to do it. So I hope that, as we move further into the 250th, I hope that Delawareans and our fellow countrymen also take it upon themselves to kind of rethink Dickinson and and what his roles. Yes, he was a leader in the Revolution. He wrote some incredibly important tracts. The Letter to the Pennsylvania Farmers. He wrote the Olive Branch Petition, the Declaration of Taking Up Arms. But he was also a pragmatic leader, and he performed in a role that we're not really familiar with, that provided valuable service to Delaware and to the nation. So I hope that during the course of the 250s, we're able to sort of take him from obscurity and bring him back into more of a central position that he deserves.